The news media are the different kinds of technologies that journalists use to report current events to a large and dispersed audience. They include print media, like newspapers and magazines, and electronic media, like radio, television, and the internet. Newspapers were the first news media in Newfoundland and Labrador. The first one entered circulation in 1807. In the 20th century, new forms of electronic media gained ground. Radio stations started broadcasting in the 1920s, and 3 decades later, the first local television station went on the air. The turn of the 21st century once again revolutionized journalism with the introduction of the internet. Today, most local newspapers, magazines, and broadcasters also have an internet presence. In 1806, Newfoundland and Labrador Governor Sir Erasmus Gower granted printer John Ryan a license to publish the colony's first newspaper. The Royal Gazette entered circulation about a year later, on August 27, 1807. The press had arrived in Newfoundland, but it wasn't a free one. The governor had final approval over all content the Gazette printed. It did run some local and foreign news, but most of its 4 pages were devoted to government proclamations, public notices, and advertisements. Print journalism was slow to expand in the coming years as governor after governor actively opposed the establishment of other newspapers. Change finally came in 1814 when Crown lawyers determined that the governor had no legal authority to stop newspapers from printing or to dictate their content. The floodgates were open to a free and independent press. The Newfoundland Mercantile Journal was the first paper to enter circulation. Many more soon followed. The press was independent, but it was far from unbiased. When the colony held its very first general election in 1832, most papers took sides. Religion and politics merged on the public stage as candidates and clergy tried to influence voters. Instead of remaining neutral, most newspapers also tried to influence the vote. This helped to shape the nature of local journalism for decades to come as the different newspapers supported the religious and political stands of their publishers and editors. By the end of the 1832 general election, the press was entrenched in Newfoundland society. It had cultivated an engaged readership and could now look to the local legislature as a source of ongoing news. Other issues also gained ground, like poverty and the growing temperance movement. In the 1860s, Confederation with Canada became a popular issue. By then, many more papers were operating, but most were weeklies, and they only circulated in St. John's and Conception Bay. The arrival of the Evening Telegram in 1879 marked the beginning of a permanent daily press in Newfoundland, and one that was cheap enough for the working class to afford at 1 cent an issue. Other dailies soon followed, like the Evening Herald and the Daily News. At the same time, a weekly press was taking root in the outports. In 1880, the Twillingate Sun became the island's first newspaper outside the Avalon Peninsula. More followed, like the Enterprise in Trinity and the Western Star on the island's west coast. The turn of the 20th century brought more changes to print journalism. Professionalism increased as newspapers began to separate the business and editorial sides of their operations. By the end of the 1930s, many publications were far less partisan than in the past, and they employed a more neutral style of reporting. This intensified after 1934, when the Commission of Government assumed power and temporarily ended party politics in Newfoundland and Labrador. The National Convention debates of the late 1940s provided another important topic to report: whether or not Newfoundland and Labrador should join Canada. The mainstream press remained largely neutral in its coverage, But the Confederate and anti-Confederate parties printed their own newspapers to promote their own arguments. They were called the Independent and the Confederate. Both stopped publishing in July 1948, which was the same month that Newfoundlanders and Labradorians voted in favor of Confederation. After 1949, items from the Canadian press regularly appeared in the new province's papers. The Canadian Press is a cooperative news agency that distributes national and international news to journalistic establishments across the country. The invention of the telegraph in the 19th century revolutionized the way that news spread across countries, continents, and the world. In 1856, a trans-island telegraph cable was laid down across the island of Newfoundland. It ran from St. John's to Carbonear, down to Cape Race, and west to Cape Ray. Submarine lines connected it to Cape Breton and plugged it in to the North American grid. This allowed news to cross the Atlantic much faster than before. Ships could stop at Cape Race to wire news to media outlets instead of sailing an extra 36 hours to Nova Scotia or another 5 days to New York. Via Cape Race became a common byline in many European and North American newspapers. And telegraph news was a regular feature of Newfoundland and Labrador newspapers. In the early 1900s, the Newfoundland and Labrador government realized that it could use the telegraph to bring a daily electronic newspaper to rural areas. It was called the Public Dispatch. Every day, news reports for the Dispatch were compiled in St. John's. They came from local newspapers, from foreign reports wired in by telegraph, and from government notices. The government post office in St. John's telegraphed the dispatch to smaller communities where postmasters transcribed it and posted it for the public to read. The Public Dispatch became the first daily news service that was widely available in Newfoundland and Labrador. Community post offices became places where people gathered to hear the news read out loud. This allowed people who couldn't read to still keep up on the news. The government ended the Public Dispatch in the 1930s. By then, the radio had replaced it as an even more accessible source of daily news. The age of radio began in the 1920s and took off in the 1930s. Instead of gathering at the local post office to hear the news, people now gathered around a radio set inside their homes. The reorientation from a public space to a private one brought the news to an even wider audience. In the early 1900s, the post office was a largely male public space, but radio sets let women hear the news in a more domestic setting. VOWR was one of the earliest radio stations in Newfoundland. It started broadcasting church services to St. John's residents in 1924 and later expanded its programming to include other content, like newscasts. In 1931, it earned high praise for its coverage of a disaster at the ice floes after an explosion destroyed the SS Viking. VOWR's updates informed listeners of rescue attempts and the names of survivors. Newspapers also reported on the disaster, but their print cycles could not provide the same kind of instantaneous reporting. By the end of the 1930s, many more radio stations were operating in Newfoundland and Labrador. Prominent among them was VOCM, which broadcast 3 newscasts a day. There was also VONF, which went on the air in November 1932. It created one of the most popular and longest-lasting daily news programs in Newfoundland and Labrador radio history, the Gerald S. Doyle News Bulletin. The bulletin broadcast local news, weather reports, and shipping information. What really stood out, though, were the personal messages sent in by listeners to be read on the air. They provided an important service for people living in remote areas that did not yet have telephone lines or newspapers. The magazine Decks Awash had high praise for the bulletin in a 1981 retrospective issue on the history of the news media in Newfoundland and Labrador. The most memorable feature of the Doyle News was that it aired 80 to 120 unpaid personal messages each day, in addition to a 15-minute newscast. Through these messages, the pulse of Newfoundland could be felt. Messages on the Doyle News were an ideal antidote to the isolation and lack of communication in rural Newfoundland. In a number of cases, messages actually saved lives by sending medical instructions to isolated nurses or notifying lost hunters of where to rendezvous with a search party. Soon, other radio shows also aired personal messages submitted by listeners. Prominent among them was The Barrelman, which was hosted by Joseph Smallwood. Like the Doyle Bulletin, The Barrelman was an eclectic mix of news, anecdotes, and messages from listeners. The popularity of both these news programs lay in both Newfoundlanders' desire for relevant information and a forum for conversation about public issues during a period when no Newfoundland legislature existed. Both programs also consisted in large part of material submitted by the audience and were thus in part a dialogue among listeners, although mediated by the broadcaster. In 1939, the Commission of Government took over VONF and converted it into the Dominion's first public radio station. It was called the Broadcasting Corporation of Newfoundland. The BCN continued to run the Doyle News Bulletin and also provided a wide range of other news and information broadcasts. For example, a fisheries program provided shipping news, weather reports, and even reported on the availability of bait in various harbors. A library program informed listeners of new books, and a series of health talks provided medical and public health news. The BCN also broadcast news provided by its British counterpart, the BBC. After Confederation with Canada in 1949, the CBC absorbed the BCN. It also opened a television station at Corner Brook in 1959, followed by another one at St. John's in 1964. But the first local television station that opened in Newfoundland and Labrador was CJON, which is also known as NTV. It began broadcasting in 1955. Soon, supper hour news shows gained a large following and competed with radio and newspapers. At the turn of the 21st century, the Internet became another popular news provider. Today, many newspapers, magazines, radio, and television news providers also maintain an Internet presence. There are also some news outlets that are entirely Internet-based.